George Feenstra of Fredericton, New Brunswick, picks up on that theme. A few years ago, he lived in East Vancouver, and he writes, in the summer of 2003, the Vancouver Police Department was instructed to clean up the Hastings corridor. This served to drive the sex and drug trades into adjacent neighborhoods. I was a minister in Mount Pleasant. The church began to offer sanctuary to street sex workers. For the most part, these persons had been finding shelter in back lanes. We allowed them to sleep on the back porch of the church, use our washrooms, and fed them breakfast in the morning. Soon, we had regular visits from a street nurse program, support from prostitute advocacy associations, and food provisions from the Salvation Army. Over time, we began to get to know these people. I remember their names: Shorty, Crystal, Red, and Carmen, who was 15 and 4 months pregnant. There is no doubt in my mind that these women were just like those found buried in the Picton yard.
Well, that email piqued our curiosity, so we asked George Feenstra to join us this morning. He is in Fredericton. Good morning.
Good morning, Anna Maria.
You say the police were asked to clean up the Hastings neighborhood in 2003. What do you remember about that?
Well, as I remember it, the Olympic Committee was coming to look at the city over and just to get prepared for the 2010 Olympics. And so lots of work was being done to just tidy the city up. And part of that work was just cleaning up the downtown east side a little bit. And so a heavy police presence began to move the people to distribute them throughout neighboring communities.
And how far is the church from the downtown east side then?
We were about 16 blocks away, just to the south.
And do you think the people you were sheltering were already living in that community?
Some of them were. I didn't discover that until after sort of it became very visible. But yes, I discovered listening to their stories that some of them, there was one girl, her name was Angie, and she actually went to Sunday school as a child in the church where I worked.
So was she the first person you met?
She was. I had found her one day in the back part of the church in a little kind of covered doorway, and she was just waiting to make a crack connection at the time, so I just got into conversation with her there.
And you helped her. What did you do?
Oh, just listen to her, get to know her a little bit, and at that time our church was sort of trying a policy of hospitality, and so we were waiting for folks to come by the church and see if we might be useful to them. And Angie was one of those first people, and so just socialize, basically show some respect and to confer some esteem.
And so at the peak of helping these people, how many were coming to your church?
Well, it was a loose community of persons, but I would say there was a core community of about 6 to 12 persons.
Mm-hmm. And for how long were they coming?
Well, this whole thing lasted from about July of 2003 till about October.
You were serving them breakfast? You were giving them shelter?
Yes, we had tea on, we had cookies available, and in the mornings at a fairly early hour we'd put porridge on and some toast, and just again to provide hospitality, to give them a sense of being welcome.
Did you do anything else? Did you try to help them get into treatment or get them out? Or?
Well, as the community began to develop, we realized it was beyond our means to care for them adequately, so we sent out some feelers, and we got a response from the street nurse program, from the Center for Disease Control. We also were contacted by PACE, Prostitution Alternatives Counseling and Education Society. We ended up in contact with a person by the name of Judy Graves from City Hall at Vancouver, who helped us try to make housing connections. And then we had needle exchange under the umbrella of the DAYS organization, the Downtown East Side Youth Activity Society.
Now, you mentioned in your letter names like Shorty, Crystal, Red, Carmen. Who were they?
Well, these are all young women for the most part, and they were folks who, as you listen to their stories, you realize there had been some tragedy or some sad event in their past which had sort of driven them away from home, left them alone and vulnerable, fallen into the trade, and become involved with predators of one kind or another, pimps and drug dealers and such. They were very real persons, and as you got to discover them, you found them to be quite charming. And there was one, her name was Crystal, and Crystal got interested in my library in my office, and she began to read poetry that I had available, and then after a bit of time, some trust developed, and she began to show me some of her own poetry, which is really quite insightful, and very, it was just great for me to be able to have access to that.
And so as you were helping them, how was the community around the church reacting?
Well, there began to be some visible signs of hostility. Meetings began to take place in the background, and folks would come to the door and tell us that we just couldn't be doing this. It wasn't appropriate for a neighborhood to have such people around. The level of resistance began to grow, and we began to experience threats of one kind or another. There was a lot of negotiating with the larger church authorities and such, trying to force us to stop our activities. Yes.
So what kind of pressure was put on the city?
On the city? Well, I'm not sure on the city. Well, the neighborhood people, the ones who were organizing this, were very aggressive in trying to get the police involved. To their credit, the Vancouver Police Department completely respected the sense of sanctuary that a church has. So they refused to intervene directly, and this frustrated the neighbors somewhat, so they began to suggest that they would take legal action against the church, and then they began to involve church authorities to try to get the church to pressure me to give the police authority to move the people away.
And what did the church authorities do?
The church authorities did finally come to the church with the police department. They authorized the police department. They had a garbage truck and some people from the sanitation department. They drove the people, the community away. They took all of their belongings and threw them into the garbage truck. Yes.
And that was that would have been on October then. Year.
It was probably just late September. Yes.
Okay, so what did the church say to you?
Well, what the church did is they took me out of my position. We have a process. It's called a 363, when a minister can come under review for what's called failing to maintain the peace of the church. And so they put me under that 363 review and took me out of the position, and so I was forbidden access to the church grounds. So the whole community was shut down, including the pastor. Why do you think that happened? Well, my reflections on it suggest that people are basically afraid of the unknown. They're afraid of the different. I've been reading Chief Justice Beverly McLachlin. She wrote an essay on the problem of difference, and she speaks about the dehumanization of those who are perceived as different. They're no longer perceived as human beings, but as some lesser species. I think there was a great level of fear involved in the decisions that were being made at that time. When you look back, is there anything you would have done differently to sort of make the community more comfortable, or would that not have been possible? Well, at that time, I was fairly deep into the theological implications of all of this and realizing that the gospel does call us to this kind of radical engagement of those who are most in need of such kinds of interventions. And so I was fairly strongly committed. I think if I were in that situation again, I would involve more persons in the decision-making process, cast about broader for support. But it came on us so unanticipated. It came on us so suddenly. We were basically reacting to demand. Because of the changes, because of the preparation for the Olympic Committee visit. That's right. It was all really quick. Yeah. There was just the movement of people from one area of town to another, which is very common in a city like Vancouver and others as well. So how can a person balance what you hope a church can do and what a community demands for its neighborhood? Well, that becomes the dilemma that we have to work with. I feel as a theologian, especially as a theologian of the cross, that on the church's part is to err on the side of the most vulnerable. And so in this case, I felt that my priority lay with those who were most in need of some kind of concrete intercession. You're coming at this from two ways, though, too, right? You're not only a theologian, but you had some experience as a young man living on the streets as well, did you not? Yes, so my theology is deeply rooted in the experience of being an outcast and of being a person at risk in the Canadian economy. And so I had a fairly heavy bias towards the position of the street people, and that may have sort of put me over the top a little bit in terms of my decision making. I probably had a prejudice. And so you are now in Fredericton. You're at the Nashwaak Sis United Church. How has what happened to you there informed what you do now? Well, it's been quite nice. I've realized that in the Maritimes, folks like to tell stories about where you fit in the social economy. And in church on Sunday mornings, they're delighted to have me tell stories about my past so that they can situate me somehow. And it's been quite remarkable. Just now it's Christmas time, and the local people are gathering goods for the people who are most in need. And at the church, because of their support of me as their minister, there's been a tremendous outpouring of support and solidarity with the poor here. We've had benefits and raised tremendous amounts of money. So I'm getting a deep sympathy from the congregation, and I'm hoping to sort of translate that into social action. And more important, I'm hoping that people in the upper middle class or the middle class will mobilize themselves to insist on differences being made in social policy at the level of law and such things. It's not enough to simply give these folks the bare necessities of life. We do have to maintain a system that recognizes that they're entitled to the rights and the freedoms that we all enjoy. George Feenstra, thanks for writing in. Thanks for talking to me today. Thank you, Anna Maria.